So anytime I make a video or a tweet or a remark to myself in my own inner monologue, there is always someone right around the corner to kindly correct me. Don't call that game a side game. That game isn't a spin-off. This game is mainline and that game isn't. Just because this game doesn't have a number in it doesn't mean it's not important. My occasionally carefree use of terminology and lack of explaining exactly what I mean every time I use certain phrases has often betrayed my intent. I know I'm making it sound like this great, tragic injustice is being committed against me anytime someone misunderstands my stance on Kingdom Hearts Birth by Sleep, and that's intentional because there is. It's not enough for thousands of people to perceive me passively while they scroll Instagram in another tab. I also have to be perfectly understood, my words thoroughly unminced. I guess I should say up top, this video is ultimately just an exercise in semantics, and sure, while it technically doesn't matter what categories we sort video games into, I could still find it interesting because language is neat and pedantry can be fun in mild doses. Looking at how people categorize these games and the differences in how they do so when given 2 options versus several more is kind of fascinating to me. My goal also isn't to make everyone agree with me, I just want everyone to get where I'm coming from. But I do also have hard lines on this matter that cannot be crossed. Like, what do you mean Dream Drop Distance is a spin-off? I am not Jan Measly, but what I lack in the ability to optimally collect and analyze data, I make up for in having strong opinions and saying fuck. This whole what is or isn't a spin-off debate in the KH context was already a bit hackneyed and contrived by the mid to late aughts and probably even earlier, so why are we doing this now? Well, it started in the same venue that all popular debate does, during a begrudging playthrough of Sonic Heroes.
Like, there should only be a finite amount of punishment for a finite amount of wrongdoing, right? That's my philosophy. That's why I think hell is like a deeply flawed concept.
Wait, sorry, it was after that. Let me jump ahead a bit.
Everyone gets so mad. Not everybody, but a lot of people. Maybe not even a lot of people. Maybe like 2 guys get so mad when I call BBS and Dream Drop like side games, because they are. Like, they're not spin-offs. Like, yeah, you do need to play them for the main story, but like when I say side games, I just mean like not numbered titles.
This ignited a conversation that would last several hours, spanning across various social medias. As a result, I and many viewers spent way too much time thinking about what it means to spin off or be spun off of. I gave my own perspective on what this all entails, and then for curiosity's sake, I ran a poll on my YouTube community page just to get more opinions. Admittedly, this poll was flawed. I am not a professional pollster, though for enough money on Patreon, I'll give it my best shot. This initial poll simply asked, are there any Kingdom Hearts video games that you would consider spin-offs? Again, admittedly, not the most airtight question, although if I made it any more specific, it would probably seem like I was engineering the question to net me a specific response. Because I think if I ask something like, do you consider any of the Kingdom Hearts games included in the Integra Masterpiece collection to be spin-offs, or of the Kingdom Hearts games that you've played, would you consider any of them spin-offs, the results probably look at least a little different. Any Kingdom Hearts video games is pretty broad, but it also kind of needs to be that way so I can allow people to draw their own conclusions. Because here's the thing, games like Kingdom Hearts VCast do/did exist even though any and all materials related to it give massive cryptid Bigfoot of KH energy. Now, there are 50,000 regular Pat subscribers and presumably even thousands more viewers who haven't subscribed because I'm a bit too pompous to support that substantially. Do all of them know about VCast and games of a similar ilk? Definitely not, and I might even wager to say that most of them don't, although maybe if you're engaged enough in what I do to be voting on my community page poll, that percentage might skew higher. But for those people who did respond and voted yes, were most of them thinking about VCast or something similar? I still feel like probably not. I mean, 3 of the top 4 comments on that post mention VCast, but I doubt even half of the nearly 5,000 people who voted read those comments. But I don't even think that's the main issue or hurdle here. The real hurdle is what even is a spin-off, because there is clearly no consensus on that. I'm a pretty self-centered guy. All of the experiences I've had in life have been in my life specifically, so I guess I'll explain my perspective first. The title of this video is There Are No, Kingdom Hearts Spin-Offs, and that's obviously just my opinion, and that asterisk is there for a snappier title because of things like VCast and Magical Puzzle Clash and Digital Painter. Frankly, I don't really care about those non-canon games as much for this conversation, but I felt compelled to include them in the follow-up survey I made because people would point it out if I didn't. This script initially included about 700 words explaining how if you really squint, none of those games are spin-offs either, but I tossed it out because it started to muddy my point and I sort of got lost in my own word sauce. So that asterisk can really be interpreted as important, or maybe more accurately, canon. As in, there are no canon Kingdom Hearts spin-offs. That's the truest way to describe my position. In my heart of hearts, my big moon of big moons, that's what I think. I know this is immediately stupid and even blasphemous to some of the more devout, and I'm sorry, and I'll do my best to justify myself. And for the record, I am not hardline committed to this absolutism. In fact, I found it really difficult to sift through my own thoughts on this, so please do challenge me on any of it. This is not me instructing or lecturing, I am explaining myself, not the truth or how things should be. The main reason why I don't consider any of the canon KH materials to be spin-offs is due to the approach Kingdom Hearts takes with its releases. Plenty of times in days gone by, a developer would make a game for the PS2 and think, hey, it would be nice to have a handheld version of our game. It might even have the same title and the same story, or one that's slightly altered and simultaneously incompatible with the console release as far as its canon goes. Most people would just make a scaled-down version of the PS2 game and put it on the Game Boy Advance. Kingdom Hearts didn't do that. Well, it sort of did, but Chain of Memories wasn't Kingdom Hearts except you can play it on the go. Well, it sort of was. For better or worse, Kingdom Hearts has been uniquely concerned with fitting everything it does into its overarching narrative. And therein lies the most important factor for me when considering spin-off categorization, which is the increased importance KH places on narrative. So while a game like Chain of Memories might look a lot like KH1 and to the layman serve as a way to experience that new, novel, wacky Disney Square blend on a handheld, it also narratively follows up on the plot of the first console release and is building up to the second console release. This was something that was plainly stated by Nomura and company in the run-up to Calm's release, but again, to the outsider looking in, it might seem like a repackaging of the original PS2 game. For the record, I don't think that most people would consider the handheld port of a console game to be a spin-off of the console game. I was just using that as a framing device to explain how Kingdom Hearts operates differently. No one thinks Shrek 2 on GBA is a spin-off of Shrek 2 on console. Both some of the better licensed games I've played, by the way. Anyway, that might all seem beside the point because most people watching this probably didn't consider Chain of Memories a spin-off in the first place. If you've made it this far into my brain rot emporium, you're probably not a layman or an outsider looking in. But I thought it was worth talking through to establish a sort of baseline and to examine how this crazy ghost train got rolling in the first place. And after all, Chain of Memories focuses on Sora, of course it's not a spin-off. Well, I don't necessarily think playing as a different character in a game that doesn't explicitly move the series timeline forward means that game must be a spin-off. And mind you, more often than not, I probably would think that if other franchises did something similar, but not with Kingdom Hearts. In many or most cases, a genre shift alone is enough for me to consider a game a spin-off, but despite the different genres and gameplay styles Kingdom Hearts has dabbled in, I've never reached the same conclusion with any of its games, and again, that's because of its core, ever-present narrative. Like, Luigi's Mansion is pretty solidly a spin-off from the Super Mario franchise in my book. You focus on a different character than usual, the gameplay is vastly different than your typical Mario platformer, and nothing that happens in it really builds on a continuous Super Mario narrative, mostly because that's not really a thing that exists. Like, yeah, King Boo shows up here, and he'll show up again in Super Mario Sunshine and some other Mario spin-offs, but his existence and reappearances aren't really impacting a narrative in a meaningful way. Which is not a bad thing, by the way. I love Luigi's Mansion and Super Mario Sunshine. But if it were Donald's Mansion or Riku's Mansion, you best believe that King Boo returning in Super Sora Sunshine would have had massive implications on Bowser's master plan to forge the Mushroom Blade. I sort of mixed my analogies there, but you get what I mean. That brings us to games like Days and Birth by Sleep, two titles that I think most people can agree are relatively important to the KH narrative, but not as much as the numbered titles are. Fewer people, however, agree on whether or not these titles are spin-offs. Obviously, you already know that I don't think they are, but those who do cite two main points. First, neither of these games directly follow up on Kingdom Hearts 2, the game that was, at the time, set furthest along in the series timeline. Second, Sora is the series protagonist, and he is not playable in either title, and is only shown briefly in both. In a myriad of other cases involving other franchises, I would agree with this assessment, but again, KH is simply built different. It bench presses these other franchises, these cowards who are too afraid to make their rhythm games canon. Nope, okay, Persona, you get a pass. I think, I'm not sure. But the events of Days and BBS, while splintered off from our main cast and going either backwards or sidewards on the timeline, still feed back into the main KH narrative. For me, that's enough to firmly consider neither of them spin-offs, but I totally understand if your definition is different from mine. On one of the community page posts, someone in the comments said that they were confused why KH fans had so much trouble determining what is or isn't a spin-off, and that, for example, something like Crisis Core is so obviously a spin-off of Final Fantasy VII. Why isn't it equally obvious that Birth by Sleep is a spin-off? But and I haven't played Crisis Core, I really don't get the impression that it is a spin-off. Again, based on my personal standards for what spin-off implies. To my understanding, Crisis Core is straight up a prequel. It follows a non-Cloud character, sure, but the events in this game directly lead into the events of FF7 and provide mountains of context and backstory for what goes on in that game. I could more so understand the claim that Crisis Core is a spin-off from mainline Final Fantasy games, like the ones that are just the words Final Fantasy with a number after it, but in relation to FF7, no way. It's part of the compilation of Final Fantasy VII, arguably the most important title behind the original game. Or maybe that's Advent Children, I don't know, I haven't seen that either, but I've read a lot about both. For me, the comparison of Birth by Sleep and Crisis Core is basically one for one. Games set in the past where you play as different characters, and the events of this game very obviously have an impact on the numbered titles. Let me get old on you for a second here. If Frasier spun off from Cheers and Frasier Crane did some shit that, like, killed Norm back at the bar in Boston, then I'd probably be less likely to consider Frasier a spin-off and instead something more akin to a companion series to Cheers. But in reality, the two aren't connected in a way where one feeds back into the other. You might watch an episode of Frasier and then go back to Cheers and have an increased understanding of Frasier Crane's character, but nothing that happens in Frasier moves any pieces or plot points along in Cheers. For another example, for all intents and purposes, Conker's Bad Fur Day, and also that Game Boy Color game that came out before it, is a spin-off of Diddy Kong Racing. Conker was just a little squirrel you could race as in that game, and then they gave him his own games. If Conker's dealings with the Great Mighty Pooh had some sort of impact on the events of future Donkey Kong games, well, I'd kind of have no choice but to no longer consider Conker a spin-off. But characters like Master Xehanort and Xion are no Great Mighty Poohs, a sentence that I did not expect to say when starting this project, but one that illustrates my point all the same. I cannot in good conscience banish these games to a separate lunch table, split up from their brethren who have numbers in their titles. Okay, just one number in their titles. And I'm sorry to say, I don't think Melody of Memory is truly a spin-off either. Am I saying Melmem is crucial in your playthrough to understand the story? No, I'm sure KH4 will recap it or be wholly enjoyable even without that handful of cutscenes. But just because it's different and light on the story doesn't mean it isn't part of that story. It bridges one game to the next, which brings me to that follow-up survey I mentioned a while back. In the aftermath of the initial Twitch convo and YouTube poll where I asked people about whether or not spin-offs exist in the KH series, I constructed a more detailed survey sent out to any corner of the internet where people are unfortunate enough to occupy space with me. This survey asked 3 major questions about each game. 1, whether or not a person completed each game or watched all of its cutscenes. 2, what a person would categorize each game as, and 3, how a person would rate each game on a scale of 1 to 10, not based on quality, but on how important that game is to fully understand the Kingdom Hearts series. My most major takeaway from this exercise is that when presented with categories beyond just main entry and spin-off, people seemed much less keen on painting with the broad spin-off brush. And that is just a turn of phrase and not a digital painter reference. I also got the impression, both from the polling results and comments left at the end of the survey, that people were more likely to consider a game a spin-off if they hadn't fully experienced its story or if they disliked the game. Oftentimes I've come across people using spin-off as a marker of quality, while I don't really view the phrase as a term of derision. But on the whole, spin-off was not thrown around as liberally when people had options like side game or bridge game to choose from. It was still used somewhat considerably when describing certain titles, which we'll get to, but the survey results were a closer reflection of my own perspective on the games, which is that they can all fit under the umbrella categories of main, side, or bridge. And people have remarked on those latter two as feeling synonymous or overlapping with each other, which I agree with, but that was sort of the point. I wanted to see what terms people would choose when presented with multiple new or less commonly employed options. And of course, because it's me, we're going to deep dive into this survey and I'll provide my thoughts on each game and its respective results. While it's not the most relevant of the 3 sections with regards to the spin-off conversation, I have data from about 3,500 people on which games they've played and not played, and that's too interesting to just gloss over. When asking about people's experience with each game, the survey provided 3 answers. You could say you beat the game, that you didn't beat it but watched all of the game's cutscenes, or that you neither beat the game nor watched all of its cutscenes. Some folks chimed in with, well, I played some of it or got really far, but then I watched all of the cutscenes. Great, then pick option 2. Some folks never played a game but did watch some of its cutscenes but gave up partway through. Great, then pick option 3. You didn't beat the game or watch all of its cutscenes. This is not me trying to be mean, but for our purposes here, I don't really care about any in-between cases, and all of those examples can still fit into one of the 3 provided options. Already, I'm a bit surprised to find that Dark Road is both the least beaten game and the least watched. Only 16% of respondents beat Dark Road, and I'll admit I would not be part of that percentage. But what surprises me more, only 47% watched all its cutscenes. I'm mainly shocked that more people have sat through all of Union Cross, which is way longer, also primarily featuring characters not in the non-mobile games. Dark Road is primarily Xehanort and Ericus, and way shorter, so I sort of anticipated that people would be more likely to sit through it. It could be that recency is working against Dark Road since it's also existed for less time. Union Cross is also fortunate enough to have the Demo 279 dub, which I consider the optimal way to experience the story. Dark Road doesn't have one yet, but it will someday. Regardless, Union Cross was the next least beaten and watched game. 19% beat Union Cross, and about 66% experienced all of its story. Honestly, a bit shocked that Union Cross did that well. I kind of expected under 50% to be fully familiar with the whole story. From then on, the stats were fairly predictable. Melody of Memory was the next lowest, with about 76% having fully experienced its cutscenes, but only 54% having actually beaten the game themselves. I'm a bit surprised that even 24% of people answering a regular Pat survey haven't watched the 20-something minutes of Melmem cutscenes, but maybe they're just saving it for later. Back cover is a bit of a weird one since there's no game to beat, just a movie to watch, which about 80% of the voting audience has done. I hope that 20% is bracing themselves for a serious spike in animal cosplay in this upcoming arc. Games like Coded and Dazed are the main reason why I had the option to vote for having beaten a game or only experiencing all of its story, just so I could see who's gone out of their way to play the DS games as opposed to only watching their movie versions. To be expected, thanks to an unfortunate lack of accessibility in the last decade or so, Coded and Dazed scored low on the game's beaten metric. Only 40% of respondents beat Recoded and 58% for Dazed. When including the folks who dragged themselves through the movies, however, those numbers increased to 82% and 95% respectively, which is pretty impressive. Despite its short runtime, 0.2 sits at 77% for the game's beaten stat, sitting right next to Back Cover and Dream Drop. I think this can be chalked up to 2.8 having the fewest and, in my opinion, least compelling offerings out of the HD collections, so I figure a chunk of players just skipped on it entirely. Half of the new content is a movie easily watched online, and the other half is a 3-hour romp through the Dark World. That leaves you with a remaster of a game that wasn't even 5 years old at the time, and when compared to the other fully remastered games, probably the one inspiring the least excitement. Only about 2/3 of respondents have beaten either version of Chain of Memories, but I'm glad to see that 96% have still watched all of its cutscenes. They probably got frustrated with the card system and said fuck it and pulled the scenes up on YouTube, which I won't even blame them for. I wasn't at all surprised by the stats regarding how many people have completed the numbered titles. KH2 scored the highest and is overall the game in the series that people are most likely to have beaten at 95.5%. Then KH1 follows at 93%, and then KH3 at 90%. Fittingly, these three games are at the very top, and aligning with my own perspective on where each game belongs in quote-unquote importance tiers, Birth by Sleep and Dream Drop are the next highest games at 87% and 80% respectively. However, the stats on the numbered titles look a bit different when we lump in the people who didn't beat the games but did watch all their cutscenes. When doing so, KH1 becomes the game with the highest percentage of people who have experienced its story at a whopping 99.6%, beating KH2 by just 0.3. There could be some slight regular Pat bias, since people watching me are probably more likely to love KH1, but if you're going to skip on either of the games, KH1 is going to be the shorter of the two to cutscene binge, so that might explain it. Interestingly though, Birth by Sleep actually has a higher percentage than KH3 when it comes to people fully watching their cutscenes. It's within 1% point, but still a bit odd. Also interesting to note, despite DDD scoring 5th for percentage beaten, it scores 7th for the percentage that combines people who have beaten it or watched its cutscenes at about 93%. It's lower than Days and Calm, both at about 96%. Since the audience would still vote that Dream Drop is more important than those two games, I'm a little surprised to see that fewer people were interested in actually experiencing its story. Despite my qualms with it as a game, I still consider Dream Drop to be relatively important when setting up for KH3, but it's possible folks just read some synopses or picked up on whatever they missed through journal entries. I figure it's also worth noting that while 90% of respondents have beaten KH3 and 96% have seen all of its story, there is a decent drop-off when comparing to the Remind DLC, which 71% of respondents have beaten, with a total of 87% having watched all its cutscenes. While I'm generally a fan of Remind, I could understand people balking at the price point, especially if they aren't really one for super bosses. Nearly 13% say they haven't played it or watched its cutscenes, which surely doesn't imply that they've watched or heard nothing about Remind, but it's pretty funny to imagine hundreds of people somehow still not knowing that the character from the Toy Box commercial went on to rob Sora at gunpoint. This section of the survey also included questions about Missing Link and KH4, mainly just to sate my own curiosity. First off, 2.6% of respondents have actually played Missing Link, the Lucky Ducks. Well, assuming it's any good, I don't really know. 62% haven't played it yet but plan to, while almost 27% don't intend on playing it but will follow its story. That leaves 14% who are completely out on it, to which I say, good luck. Someday the cold Union Cross water is going to splash all of us and we'll all learn our lesson. All Kingdom Hearts fans do these days is charge their phone, buy Kyrie Metal, and die. The question about KH4 was a bit simpler. 96% plan on playing and 3% don't but will watch its cutscenes. Which, understandable, this game has good odds to only be on expensive consoles and not everyone has the means to acquire one of those. Interestingly though, 1% have no interest in KH4 whatsoever. I mean, that's only 34 people, but it's not nothing. Maybe they really didn't like 3 and have no hope left, or they really liked 3 and want the series to go out on a high note, or they like taking surveys about franchises they don't follow. Again, I also included the games that I don't consider canon just to see what people had to say about them. I won't go into too much detail on them here, but I'll show you these pie charts if you're curious. VCast and VR Experience were the titles people were most familiar with, while Gummy Ship Studio and Digital Painter were largely unknown. If you're among this yet-to-be-enlightened group, the channel Aid1043 has done some great work deep diving into these more obscure KH relics. As to be expected, when asked how important the audience considered these weirdo games, they all scored poorly, boasting an average score under 2 in each case. To me, they're all equally unimportant, but here's their ranking if you want to see. What I'm more interested in is the average importance score of the canon games, which was generally in line with my own take on the matter, with a few switch-ups. At the top of the board are the numbered titles, as I expected. If they're not practically 10s, I don't know what would be. If you want to get really ticky-tack, KH2 was labeled most important, followed by 1 and then 3. And they were close. They're all 9.8s, and KH1 and 3 are only separated at the 5th decimal place. For me, it's nearly impossible to try and determine which of these games is the most important to experiencing the KH story. It's like asking if the cheese, sauce, or crust is the most important part of a pizza. Which, it's the sauce, and KH1 is the sauce. How could it not be the most important if that's where everything started, Jesus Christ? I mean, I get it, if you had to cram for an exam about Kingdom Hearts, you'd probably spend the least time studying KH1. It arguably has the least vital information when taking the entire series into account. But it's just weird for me trying to rationalize how anything can be more important than the game that introduces the corest of core elements. But I'm sort of just splitting hairs and being annoying about it, that's sort of my jam. The numbered titles are followed by Birth by Sleep at a 9.1 importance score, then Dream Drop at 8.5, and then Chain of Memories at 8 flat. I'm pretty sure I agree with this. Some might quibble with Calm being as high as it is, considering the gang forgets about what goes on in Castle Oblivion, but it's still the origin point for the organization, or at least a presence larger than a lightsaber ballet recital. Beneath Calm is Days at 7.6, which I think I also tend to agree with. Days fleshes out a chunk of time that we didn't have full context on, but could have survived without. I'm glad we got it, but it mainly served to flesh out an already strong Roxas narrative. Despite the low scores for it in the game beaten and story fully experienced metric, Union Cross is next at a 6.4 importance score. I've been one to bemoan how such major plot threads originate in a game that you can't even play anymore, but I can't deny that these threads are major and important and are going to come into play in a big way very soon. Next was Back Cover at 5.9, which makes sense as it's essentially a voiced extension of the key stuff, touching on some but not nearly all of the threads introduced in that saga. 0.2 is just behind it at 5.8, 0.2 is the name of a game, 5.8 is the score, just so we're clear on that. That's also totally fair, despite my adoration of that game. It has some cute moments that tie back into KH1, but the bulk of it is nothing that couldn't have been assumed by the time Aqua is rescued in KH3. Third to last is Dark Road at 5.3, which I'm not sure what to make of. I feel like it's probably more important than 0.2 in the grand scheme of things, but it also mainly focuses on characters who we know are already dead. But it's got some twists and reveals in its later hours that'll likely have grander implications than Aqua's journey through the Dark World. Second to last is Melody of Memory at a 5.2, which I can't really argue with despite defending Melmem's status as a non-spin-off. I would be shocked if what little we get of narrative substance isn't recapped or flat out shown again in KH4, a la the scene of Sora departing for Olympus in 0.2 and KH3. Humorously, this leaves Coded in last place out of the canon games at an importance score of 4. Part of me thinks that this should at least be above Melmem, but I do struggle to find a good reason. Coded introduces the concept of data worlds, and later in the series the game will be referenced, I'd say a handful of times, but it'd have to be like Little Chef's Hand. I'll say this, when I first played Coded in 2011, I was in 8th grade, and after the first few hours, even young Patty knew, oh, none of this is really gonna matter, is it? Now we get into where the audience places each game under the 5 categories I provided: main, side, bridge, spin-off, and non-canon. There was also an I don't know option for those who did not know.
I don't know.
That one saw a lot of use when I asked about all of those weirdo games that you may have never heard of. For Kingdom Hearts Mobile, Gummy Ship Studio, Digital Painter, and VR Experience, the most common response was, I don't know enough about this to categorize it, which, totally fair. For VCast and Magical Puzzle Clash, people were more confident in designating them as non-canon. In every case for these weirdo games, spin-off was always the third most common response, with all other responses being basically negligible. I should say, there can definitely be some overlap here, as I don't think non-canon and spin-off are mutually exclusive terms, but people were more keen on identifying these games firstly as non-canon before identifying them as spin-offs. But I could even see an argument that something like Magical Puzzle Clash is more spin-off-y than it is non-canon, mostly because there's nothing happening in this shovelware-esque Match 3 game that really contradicts anything happening in Days or any other KH game. It's so vague and nebulous, and there is no actual story, it's just Bejeweled except it listens to Paramore. Then you've got something like VR Experience, which is really just a tool that allows you to view Kingdom Hearts stuff from a first-person perspective. Calling it non-canon totally makes sense, considering it also doesn't have its own story or impact the story of other games, but that's almost like saying playing KH2 in first-person mode is non-canon. A considerable chunk of people, 15.4%, firstly regard VR Experience as a spin-off, and I can't really fault them for that. VCast is another funny one, as most people said it's not canon, but 7.5% of respondents called it a spin-off. VCast contextualizes itself as a dream, and while it's sort of a lazy way to write an ending, it's the exact kind of laziness we'd need to cram VCast into the canon. Who says a dream isn't canon? Well, Nomura and Square Enix about this dream specifically, but I mean in this hypothetical vacuum where we want VCast to be canon. Which, for the record, I don't care about it at all, but if I did, there's an exploitable opening here. All of these cheap oddity games can be canon if we just say, it was a dream, but Sora doesn't want to talk about it. But whatever, that's beside the point. You want to hear about the actual games and what people had to say about them. As you'd probably expect, there is overwhelming consensus regarding KH1, 2, and 3. At minimum, 99.5% of the audience considered them all main entries. I'd like to consider myself an open-minded person, but I have to imagine the 0.3 to 0.5% of other responses can be chalked up to trolling or misclicks. Like, 3 people said KH1 is a spin-off. And I mean, I guess if you tilt your head and don't think too hard about anything ever, you might conceive KH1 as something that quote-unquote spun off from Final Fantasy and or Disney films, but we're not going to do that. After that, things get more interesting. The next highest percentage score for main entry status is Birth by Sleep at 67. And honestly, I can still be convinced any which way on this one. Well, besides calling it a spin-off like 2% of people did, but I've already explained why I disagree with that. It's been a while since I took my own survey, sorry about the wait by the way, but I think I slotted BBS into the side game category. But if there's one non-numbered title in the series to be granted main entry status, it is absolutely Birth by Sleep. It's effectively Kingdom Hearts 0 in all but name. Its plot directly influences the main narrative, and by extension KH3, and the only things really holding it back from obvious consensus main entry status is it being a prequel and lacking a playable Sora. Of the non-numbered titles, skipping BBS prior to playing KH3 will probably leave you with the biggest knowledge gap for the Xehanort Saga's payoff. After all, the guy the saga is named after is properly introduced in his original form in this game. So I can be swayed to changing my answer. In fact, I think I am. Good job, me. The only other category I have a hard time getting behind is bridge game, because I don't really know what BBS is in the middle of to serve as a bridge. You could say 2 and 3, but that doesn't feel quite right. 2 and Dream Drop? I don't know, I think side game or main entry feel more justified. Speaking of, Dream Drop is another polarizing one, with about half of respondents also considering it a main entry. For me, the numbered titles alongside BBS and DDD have always been the big 5 of the series, but Dream Drop has comfortably sat at the bottom of that hierarchy. There's definitely a case to be made for calling it a main entry, maybe even more so than Birth by Sleep. It's at least half Sora-led, and it is fully a sequel to past games, moving the plot forward. The biggest knock against it is its gameplay style differing from the numbered games, and I guess also not having a number in its title. Although, technically, it does. Once again, I can be swayed on this one. This game is by no means something that should be yada-yada'd, or one that reasonably could be, like a Recoded. To me, it bridges 2 and 3, and that was the second most popular audience interpretation, but not a hill I'm willing to die on. Especially because if I do die and I hit retry, I have to restart the battle with my commands not fully loaded for some fucking reason. I will never let go of this. Then we get to Chain of Memories, which is, to me, the definition of a bridge game, and the audience mostly agreed. The terms bridge game and side game may ostensibly seem interchangeable, but I do think there is a distinction worth making with games that effectively serve as middle points between two other entries. The games that I would categorize as bridge games share some common elements and themes with the two games on either side of it, whereas a side game is more so either related to just one other entry or largely separated from everything before and after it. To me, COM is a pretty open and shut case. It picks up immediately where KH1 leaves off and properly introduces the next main threat and narrative themes, both of which return in KH2. About 65% of respondents agreed that it doesn't get much bridgier than that, but 29% grant Chain of Memories a main entry card. I can't knock that entirely since it does follow Sora, but of the non-numbered titles we've discussed so far, I'd say it's the least important for comprehending and enjoying the saga as a whole. It's arguably more important for providing context for just KH2 than the series in general, but I won't fault anyone for calling it a main entry. 0.2 had a similar looking distribution, boasting the second highest bridge game percentage at 58%. I definitely agree there, it bridges Birth by Sleep and 3. It directly follows up on what Aqua's up to after her sacrifice in BBS, and it also practically serves as a prologue to KH3, right down to including a prototype cutscene from KH3 itself. You also absolutely don't need to play it to have a complete enough understanding of everything prior to KH3, so as cool as it is, I wouldn't call 0.2 a main entry. Now things start to get really split because no one could agree on what to call Days. Of the canon games I've talked about so far, Days has the lowest percentage of main entry supporters at 21%. As much as I've come to appreciate Days over the years, I can't really get on board with making that distinction. If Square Enix themselves didn't find it necessary to remaster the game on a disc where the whole point of the occasion was to remaster all the games, I find it difficult to call Days a main must-play entry in the series. You should play it if you can. I think it's one of, if not the most emotionally resonant game in the franchise, but it's always firmly been a supporting actor in the series. An also-ran, if you will. From there, the main split is between calling it a side or bridge game, and again, these two categories are similar in function enough that it doesn't really matter, but since we're already here doing this, we might as well fully dive in. I would err on the side of calling Days a side game because, for lack of a better explanation, it just feels like it's set off to the side of everything rather than truly connecting two other entries. Like, sure, it does take place in between 1 and 2, partly concurrently with the events of Chain of Memories, so you could argue it bridges 1 and 2 in the same way that COM does. But I don't know, aside from when it's set and some KH1 worlds showing up and those nifty bottom screen moments, it doesn't really feel that connected to KH1 and leans much more KH2, probably by virtue of it releasing after KH2. I think if Days were focused on Sora in the way that COM is, I'd be more likely to say that it bridges 1 and 2. Notably, Days had nearly 3% of the audience deeming it a spin-off, the biggest percentage chunk of the canon games so far. To reiterate what I said earlier, in basically any other franchise I'd be inclined to agree, but KH2 and Days are no Friends and Joey. Normally, playing as Joey in the Hollywood that never was doing missions for Jennifer Coolidge would be a completely insular experience. But in reality, what Joey does here will have an impact on what happens back at Central Perk, and the events of this game set the foundation for the revival of Smelly Cat. I have never watched either of these shows, and I don't really know what I'm talking about anymore. Coded is sort of all over the place, with only 8% of the audience willing to call it a main entry. I'm sure you can already tell, but if I was hesitant to categorize COM and Days as main entries, you probably know how I feel about extending that courtesy to Coded. About 56% of the audience landed on side game for Coded, and I couldn't agree more. There is nothing more off to the side than this meandering putz-a-thon through Jiminy's journal. Where it's not playing something like a Days and then playing KH3 will have you genuinely echoing one of the least funny running gags in the fandom, Who's Shion, skipping Coded will have close to zero impact on your experience. You might raise an eyebrow during that one early game scene in Twilight Town, but it's almost like that moment is there to explicitly justify the fact that they made Coded. 21% of the audience calls Coded a bridge game, and I suppose it would be Bridging 2 and Dream Drop, but I don't personally think there's enough cohesion with or a direct follow-up to or from either of those two games to make that call. Now, I will be the first to kick Coded while it is very, very far down in my game rankings, and encourage people to substitute playing or watching it with reading a wiki synopsis, but I will defend to the death its right to not be called a spin-off, which almost 12% of respondents did. As little, and I mean little, impact this red and black crusty cube has on the series moving forward, it does have impact. It's the story of Mickey's letter at the end of KH2, a very main title, and even though it's not referenced a ton in the games that follow, it is acknowledged. The themes it explores, especially in its final hours, are revisited in later games, as clunkily as I feel that exploration is handled. Furthermore, a little over 1% said coded isn't even canon, which I do think has to consist of trolling and or people genuinely not understanding what canon means. Again, as much as I don't really like or care about coded, it's still a member of this fucked up little family. And within that fucked up little family is the really fucked up part. Like your dad's side of the family, who you never see even on holidays. They've never even sent you a birthday card, but for some reason you've sent them $9.99 USD to get a Coco medal. Of course, I'm talking about the mobile-verse. Of everything I've talked about in this video, I am the least confident in my thoughts regarding Union Cross and its related materials. A decent chunk of the audience can commiserate with me on that, as around 10 to 20%, depending on the entry, didn't know what to make of them either. Amusingly, almost nobody tried to call them non-canon, which I'm genuinely shocked by. Either people really dislike coded, or maybe they got it mixed up with VCast or something. Despite my issues with the gameplay, stylings, and the story delivery of the mobile games, it is undeniable that they have planted the seeds for some big goddamn trees that are going to be sprouting in KH4 and beyond. In fact, we've seen some saplings in KH3 already. For this reason, I am extremely hesitant to label any of them spin-offs. About 20% consider Union Cross a spin-off, 17% for Back Cover, and 19% for Dark Road. Of those three, Dark Road is the one I am most amenable to, but only because I think it's going to have less relevance than Union Cross moving forward. But I've already given my stance on the nature of spin-offs and how Kingdom Hearts handles plot threads, so I truthfully don't think Dark Road is a spin-off either. If it matters even a little for what lies ahead, it's not a spin-off. It might be a flawed perspective, but it's the one I'm sticking to. The Union Cross, Back Cover, and Dark Road pie charts basically look the same, and the biggest slice of each is side game, which is where I think I fall. You could consider KH4 to be one end of the bridge for something like Union Cross, but I'm less sure of what's on the other side. I can sympathize with the main entry stance for Union Cross, but only because the game introduces so many key players, not really because of what happens in the game itself. I really hope KH4 is going to go hard on retelling the plot of Union Cross, or providing ample journal entries to get players up to speed on it, because I don't want the internet to be insufferable about who Strelitzia or Skuld are. I mean, it still will be, but maybe we can mitigate some of that. Finally, we're left with Melody of Memory, which has the most spread out responses. Another big takeaway from this exercise is that there's always going to be a good chunk of people who are willing to call any canon game a main entry, because even Melmem had about 10% saying that. But of the canon games, Melmem has the highest percentage of spin-off voters at 22.4. I think this is largely due to its dramatic genre shift away from most of the rest of the series, and the small amounts of backloaded story content we get in this game. But to me, Melody of Memory is solidly a bridge game between KH3, specifically Remind, and KH4. It directly follows up on Sora's disappearance at the end of 3, and unless they shadow drop some kind of dream drop or Birth by Sleep 2 on us, is setting up for Riku and Kairi's path forward into KH4. To me, it doesn't matter that Sora is barely here, that it's a rhythm game, or that the story offerings are meager. If the Kingdom Hearts Tamagotchi contained a character or plot thread that had implications on the series moving forward, I would not be able to call it a spin-off or non-canon. Both categories that I do not think Melody of Memory falls under. And there you have it. Those are my findings and my take on them. If you're interested in really digging into the data, I had a team of patrons led by gotvodka720 conduct some additional data analysis. I am not smart enough to talk about the nitty-gritty stuff both confidently and in an engaging manner. Frankly, I struggled to do that for what I did talk about, but I'll have their findings linked in the description. Big thanks to them for taking time out of their days to help me with my nerd quest. And a big thanks to you for watching it. Please harm each other in the comments about what I discussed here today, as it's good for engagement and helps me line my pockets. Everyone thinks they're tough shit until someone brings a canon to the non-canon debate.
He's nuts!
Hey, long time no see. You know, I've realized over the years that nobody in this format of video besides me does this thing where they show up at the end at live action and kind of just shoot the shit. But I've been doing it for too long, I feel like it'd be weird to stop now. I guess I'll say now, if you like the video, please consider giving it a like, it helps out a lot. Subscribe if you want to see more stuff from me like this, and if you really enjoy it, I have a Patreon, patreon.com/regularpat. I do a lot of cool stuff there. As you can see, I have moved so long to the room where Regular Pat began. 5 years ago, almost to the day. It was August 31st, 2019 when I started off on this little old journey of mine, and I would not be sitting in this new apartment with the lovely Regular GF if not for the support of all of you out there for years and years now, so thank you so much. I do apologize for the wait between the last actual release and this one. It's been a long, crazy summer for me between the moving. I got COVID at a point, so I was down for the count there for a bit. Moving is tough. I kind of underestimated that. Not just like the day of, but you know, the preparation and the settling and getting everything livable when you get there. It's been a task, but we're making it work, and I love my new office. I got regular GF's Bidoof watching over me at all times. I think the cat from Kiki's delivery service on the PS5. But yeah, I just wanted to check in and say thank you for watching, thank you for your patience, and I've got a lot of fun stuff planned for the back half of 2024, so stay tuned. Until then, stay safe out there, and I'll see you next time. Take it easy.